I'm 25 now, but I was 17 when this happened. I'm 6 feet tall, and for lack of a better word, I'm brawlic. I don't scare easily, and I never run from a fight. It was my senior year of high school, and I went to a party with my now ex-girlfriend. I let her drive, which was my first mistake. Long story short, we ended up arguing on the way home. The party was up in the hills. I live in upstate New York in a city called Elmira, and the hills surround my city. So in my drunken logic, I thought I'd hop out of the car while driving home because she was annoying me. I quickly realized that this was a bad idea, because it was still a good 30-minute drive from my house. But in my drunken pride, I refused to call my girl back. By then, it was about 2:30 a.m., and I was trying to call my friends to come and pick me up. Hardly anyone was answering. I finally got a hold of my friend Tyler. He said he was going to be on his way in a minute, and that I should just stay on the road that I was walking on. I started playing music on my phone and walked. There were woods on both sides of me. There was the road, then a small ditch, and then a 5-foot incline of straight trees and bushes. It was technically a 2-lane road, but there were no painted lines or anything of the sort. I started hearing noises coming from the woods on my right. I turned off the music and stood still. I heard something moving, probably around 15 feet to my right, but the sound stopped a couple seconds later. It was like whoever it was didn't realize I had stopped and caught myself. I stood there for a minute, then brushed it off and started walking down the middle of the road in case there was something there. Since I was drunk, the normal warning bells that should have been going off weren't. I was just listening to the woods and bugs while walking, which was kind of creepy. Then I heard it again. It was like somebody was walking and not even trying to be quiet. I stopped again. Then the sound started to get louder. Whoever it was walking towards me. I walked around with a box cutter on me at all times. Elmira wasn't the best town, and a fight, or worse, was always around the corner. Look up Elmira, New York on the Urban Dictionary. It's kind of funny, but pretty spot on. At this time, I pulled it out. This huge guy stepped out from the tree line. Like I said before, I'm a well-built guy, and by no means small. This guy towered over me though, and on top of that, he was raised up by about 5 feet. He was wearing a brown Carhartt jacket with the hood up. I could tell he was older because he had white hair and his stubble. He had a weird face. Think like Dolph Lundgren, that weird jawline, all of it. I couldn't see much else of him. Being as drunk as I was and not knowing what to do, I said, "Man, you scared me. How you doing?" He just stood there, said nothing. He stared at me, with his hands in the front pockets of his jacket. This dude gave me a really bad vibe, so we had a staring contest for about 30 or 45 seconds, but it felt much longer, and then I said, "You good, bro?" Still nothing. I started walking sideways so I could keep an eye on the guy, and then I pulled out my phone and called Tyler to see where he was. The dude didn't move, he just turned his body and kept staring at me. By then, I was walking backwards to keep my eyes on him, and then Tyler told me he was close. While talking, I noticed that the dude disappeared. I started hearing more noises in the woods. I told Tyler to hurry up. At this point, I was on the opposite side of the road with my box cutter, walking sideways and staring at the woods. Tyler finally pulled up. I told him on the phone what was happening, and he got out of his car. Then everything went silent, so we turned the flashlights on our phones and started looking into the woods. We heard people talking and murmuring, then a lot of noise. Like 5 to 10 people were breaking branches to get to us. We looked at each other and booked it to his car. As we were pulling off, 3 or 4 shadows jumped out onto the road and stared at the car. The question is, what were those people doing out there in the middle of nowhere, with no flashlights or anything, at 3 a.m.? I have no idea, but I'm glad my ride pulled up. I'm also glad I made sure to talk loud on the phone and let him know I was being picked up. I don't mess with the woods now, for good reason. My dad had always been really into camping and nature. He and my mom had gone on a few trips before, but I was too young. When I was around 9 or 10, I went with them for the first time. Where we were going, it was only accessible by canoe. My dad thinks that real camping has to be difficult, otherwise what's the point? My mom had taken me and my brothers to a campground once. It had car access and public washrooms, and my dad scoffed at it. I could see where he was coming from. You might as well just camp out in the backyard if you're going to do that. We planned to spend 3 nights in the wilderness, fishing and hiking, and enjoying the great outdoors. We spent a day hiking and paddling in, and eventually we found a good spot right on the water. We set up camp on the first night, and my parents built a fire as the sun began to set. After dinner, I was tired and I went to bed early, leaving my parents to enjoy the peacefulness of the wilderness. As I drifted off to sleep, the sounds of the forest lulled me into a peaceful slumber. But in the morning, everything was very different. I woke up to the sound of my parents tearing down camp and packing up our canoe. They were already up, and I was alone in the tent. It was only dawn, and we were supposed to stay for 3 nights, so I was confused. I went out and asked them what was going on, but they just told me that we had to leave early. They didn't even offer an explanation, and I could tell they were on edge. I had no idea what the problem was, but I went along with it. We spent the day paddling and hiking out the same way we came. It was frustrating. I felt like we had worked so hard to get there, and now we were just leaving. I complained the whole way back. I'm sure it was really annoying, but my dad wouldn't tell me why we had to leave. Eventually, I let it go, and I forgot about it. Years later, my parents finally told me what happened that night. While they were up around the campfire, a man appeared from the woods and walked up to them. Like I said, it was a really remote area, and you had to canoe to it. There were other sites around, but they were all accessed from the water, as far as I knew. It was really weird for somebody to come out of the woods, and there were no real trails there. They told me that the man was older and dirty, like he had been out there for a long time. My dad also noticed that he had a gun on his belt. He asked my parents for food. He was very polite and calm, they said, but it was still really creepy. They didn't want to provoke him, so they gave him some food and water. After that, he thanked them and walked back into the woods. They stayed up all night around the fire, too scared to go to sleep. We still have no idea where he came from, or where he went. If he was just another camper from another site, then why would he show up in the middle of the night? He must have realized how creepy that would be. I have no idea who he was, but my parents definitely made the right decision to get out of there. Hearing this story sent shivers down my spine. It was like something out of a horror movie. I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if the guy had decided to do something more sinister. We were sitting ducks out there. Neither of my parents carry a gun, so whatever that guy wanted to do, he would have been able to do. We couldn't stop him. This happened in the summer of 2002. I was 28 years old and living on my own in Montana. I had always loved hiking, so this part of the country was perfect for me. There was something about being out in nature that made me feel alive, so when my friend Doreen suggested that we go hiking on a remote trail, I jumped at the chance. We would have to book a cabin in the area, which was fine with me because I always loved planning things like that. We started early in the morning, hoping to beat the heat. The trail was beautiful, winding through dense forests and rocky terrain. We talked as we walked, enjoying each other's company and the peaceful surroundings. For most of the morning, we didn't see another person at all. We knew there were other hikers out there because we had seen footprints and the occasional cigarette butt. But it was so vast that we never saw any of them. After a few hours, we stopped for a break and sat on the side of the trail. That's when we saw a man, standing a ways down the trail. He seemed to be watching us. He looked out of place. He wore a tattered brown coat and had a wild gray and brown beard. He didn't look like a hiker. He wasn't dressed for it. It was a hot day in the summer, and this guy was dressed like it could be a cool day in autumn. I don't know how he wasn't sweating to death. The creepy part, though, was that he was staring at us. Doreen and I looked at each other. I could tell that she was scared. She probably sensed the same thing from me. We didn't know what to do. We considered turning back, but we'd already come so far, and we were both determined to finish the hike. We decided to keep walking. We hoped the man would stay put, and we wouldn't have to run into him again. But as we rounded the bend in the trail, there he was, standing in the middle of the path. He looked even more scary up close. His eyes seemed to bore into us. He didn't say anything, just stared at us with a strange intensity. We tried to walk around him, but he stepped in our way. Doreen and I both felt a sense of dread wash over us. We knew something wasn't right. Suddenly, he lunged at us, and we both screamed. But then he just laughed, revealing yellow, crooked teeth.
"Relax, ladies,"
he said.
"I'm not going to hurt you."
But we didn't believe him. We squeezed past him and ran down the trail as fast as we could. We didn't stop until we were out of breath, and we couldn't hear his footsteps anymore. We continued on the trail, our hearts racing. We didn't see the man again, but we constantly kept an eye out for him. We went back to our cabin that evening. We were spending the night there, and heading back in the morning. There was no TV, and this was before cell phones. There was an old radio, though, and we were listening to a local station. We heard a news report on the radio about an escaped criminal who was on the loose in the area. He had been targeting hikers and campers. They never got specific about what he was wanted for, though. Our minds filled in that part, and we assumed the worst. Doreen and I both looked at each other, probably thinking the same thing. We immediately called the police and told them about the man we had seen on the trail. We described him as best we could and gave them the location of where we had seen him. The police arrived at our cabin later, and we gave them every detail about what happened. We didn't know if they'd be able to catch him, but we knew we had to do everything we could to help. The next day, the police called us with an update. They had to close down the trail for the time being, because our description matched the man they were looking for. They didn't want anyone else to end up in a situation like we found ourselves in. We heard that the man was eventually caught. It turned out he had been camping out in the park for a few weeks at the time when we saw him. They told us that we were incredibly lucky, because he was probably getting pretty desperate for food and money. He most likely would have done something if we hadn't run away when we did. We drove home that day as planned. As crazy as the experience was, we did get over it, and we still hit the trails at least a few times every year. To understand why my mother and I were at Whitlock Lake, I have to give you some background on us. My mother and I run a wreath business in a quiet northern Michigan town. Violent crimes are virtually non-existent. It was fall, and around this time of year, the forests in Michigan become rich with color. This day was full of warmth and color, and instead of buying pine cones for decorating the wreaths, we decided to go foraging for them in our local woods. I knew about Whitlock Lake from my high school days. Some of my friends and I went there a couple times to party. It's a small camping area with about 3 sites. The lake is connected to a bigger lake a few miles down the road. It's in a small old logging town called Jennings, population 20, maybe a little less or more. The times I went out there in high school, there was never a strange feeling in the air. The day my mother and I went to forage, the air was thick with fear, and we felt like we were being watched. We thought maybe it was just a small woodland creature hiding and watching, waiting for us to leave, so we continued. About an hour went by, and we decided to move on. We moved to where the forest meets the water. There were cute little tiny baby pine cones there that we used for our tabletop wreaths. Shortly after, we found ourselves on the edge of the lake. We heard a few gunshots from across the lake. Like I said, this was northern Michigan, so people were getting ready for hunting season around this time, so we shrugged it off. We got into our car and moved down the trail. When we got out of my car, I noticed quite a few shotgun shells on the ground. Again, It's not uncommon to find shells of any sort on the ground this time of year, so we continued. We were at the end of the trail, with the last 2 campsites on either side. We continued foraging for about 20 minutes. As we walked across the trail to the next site, we noticed something very strange. At the opening of the campsite, we noticed a tall 5 or 6 foot wooden pole. On the top of that pole, we saw 2 leather straps wafting in the wind. To us, that was strange. Why would somebody want leather straps on a pole? Of course, we put it out of our minds and continued. A short while later, we stumbled upon an old beat-up mattress that looked like it had been there for a while. As we got closer to the mattress, the ground around it was very mucky. As soon as you stepped somewhere, you sunk about a half foot down. People dump garbage in the woods a lot up here. When we started walking past it to get to the other pine cones, this horrible smell seeped into our nostrils. We both looked at each other at the same time, and then got out of there. By then, we were scared out of our wits. As we were driving out of the trailhead, we were met by a guy in a red Cadillac-type vehicle. The look on his face really scared us. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was all in our heads. I would like to think that my mother and I have a good sense for that sort of thing, and we got out of there just in the nick of time. Needless to say, my mother and I have never been back to that lake, and we don't plan on going back anytime soon. About a week later, I couldn't hold this event inside me anymore, and I called the cops and recalled the incident as best I could. They said they would look into it, and I haven't heard anything since. This happening still haunts me to this day. I'm always thinking of what may have actually happened out there.